Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, at least for a philosopher like you, listener. I mean, we all know what pain is, right? We've all felt it.
Right.
But when you actually start to pick it apart, think about what it really means, especially in terms of all those things you're already deep into: subjectivity, how we perceive the world, consciousness itself. It gets really complex really quickly.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those things, it feels so basic, so fundamental to being human.
Totally.
But the more you dig in, especially from a philosophical angle, the more you realize, how much we take for granted about it. And that's kind of what we're doing today.
Exactly. So we're using this really comprehensive Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on pain. It's kind of like the go-to resource for this topic.
Yeah.
And we're going deep, really unpacking the arguments, the different theories, the points where, things get a little messy and maybe even a little mind-bending.
Exactly. It's about, pulling out those philosophical threads, the stuff that'll really make you think, wow, I never thought about it that way.
Exactly. So I guess, right off the bat, the entry throws us into this thing called the act-object duality. And it's this inherent tension in how we typically think and talk about pain.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, we have this idea that pain is located in the body. We say, I have a sharp pain in my hand or a throbbing pain in my
You
leg.
think it's a thing right there.
Exactly. It feels like we're pinpointing something concrete, an actual thing, almost like a physical object inside us. And, our behavior reinforces this. When something hurts, we clutch it, we rub it.
Exactly. And that's where it gets interesting because it seems so straightforward at first. You feel pain, you locate it, you react. But philosophically, it opens up a whole can of worms.
Right, because then we have these cases that kind of throw a wrench in that simple picture.
Mhm.
The entry brings up phantom limb pain and, that situation where you have damage but are anesthetized.
Right.
And those examples really force us to confront the fact that the relationship between a physical state and the experience of pain, it's not a simple one-to-one mapping.
Exactly. I mean, how do you have pain in a limb that's not even there?
Yeah.
And conversely, if you have tissue damage, but you're numb, you don't feel anything, then what is pain?
Right, exactly. It can't just be
Yep.
about a physical state, right?
Right.
And that brings us to the second side of this duality, the subjective experience of pain.
Right. That it's not just a physical signal, it's how it's felt, how it's experienced.
Exactly. And the International Association for the Study of Pain, they get right to this in their definition of pain. They say it's an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience
Yeah.
and emphasize that it's always subjective.
Yeah. It's key for any philosopher. Subjectivity, what it means to feel something, to have that first-person perspective.
Totally. And this definition, it highlights those features of pain that are so philosophically juicy, so to speak. It's privacy, subjectivity, the way it just pops into your awareness, and that feeling of absolute certainty, like you can't be wrong about it.
You can't deny it, right? You're feeling it. End of story.
Right. So let's break those down a little. First, privacy. My pain is mine, and only I have direct access to it.
It's not like looking at, say, an apple, which we can both see and agree on its properties. Pain is locked in your own experience.
Exactly. And subjectivity, this is where it's really interesting. An apple exists, whether I'm looking at it or not. But can pain exist without being felt?
That's the question, right? Is it dependent on that conscious awareness? If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, does it make a sound?
Right. Does an unfelt pain even make sense? And then there's this self-intimating aspect. It just sort of announces itself, bursts into your consciousness.
You don't have to go searching for it. It demands your attention.
Exactly. And that leads us to the idea of incorrigibility. It's that deep sense of knowing, of being certain about your own pain. Like Kripke said, you can't be wrong about the immediate feeling of pain. You might misinterpret it, maybe think it's coming from a different place than it actually is, but the raw feel, that's undeniable.
And that raises a whole other set of questions about knowledge and how we know things about the world and ourselves. Can we be wrong about anything if we can't be wrong about our own pain?
Exactly. So we have this tension, this act-object duality. On one hand, we locate pain in the body, almost like a physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other, it's this subjective, private experience that we seem to have absolute authority over. And that tension is where a lot of the philosophical debate kicks off.
Yeah, it sets the stage for all these different theories, each trying to make sense of this puzzle.
Right. So one early attempt to tackle this, as the entry explains, was through sense datum theories. And I know for a philosopher this is familiar territory, but how did it apply to the specific puzzle of pain?
So sense datum theories, they basically say we're not directly perceiving the world, but rather these mental intermediaries called sense data.
Right, like a mental representation.
Exactly. Like if you see a mirage, you're not actually seeing water, but you are seeing a sense datum of water.
Yeah.
And some philosophers, like Broad, they argued that pains are like these sense data.
So the pain itself isn't a physical thing in your body, but a mental object.
Yeah, and this mental object, this pain sense datum, it has its own properties, like being sharp, throbbing, burning. And it exists only when it's being felt, which ties back to the subjectivity we talked about.
So it neatly addresses both sides of the duality. It's an object of awareness, the sense datum, but it only exists when you're experiencing it.
Exactly. But of course, it wouldn't be philosophy if there weren't some wrinkles to iron out.
Right, because if these pain sense data are mental things, where are they? I mean, if I feel pain in my toe, does my mind extend into my toe?
Yeah, that's the location problem, and sense datum theorists had different ways of dealing with it. Some, like Jackson, took it quite literally. They said, yep, these mental objects, they're located right where the pain feels like it is.
But that raises some really weird questions, right? Like,
Yeah.
what does it even mean for the mind to have a spatial location? And can other people interact with these mental objects in my toe?
Totally. It gets very metaphysically tricky.
So what other options were there?
Well, Price, for example, he talked about a phenomenal space. So there's the physical space of our bodies, and then there's this separate phenomenal space where our experiences exist. So the pain in your toe, it's located in your phenomenal toe, not the physical one.
Okay, so that avoids the mind stretching into your toe problem.
Yeah.
But now you have this whole other problem of explaining how these two spaces interact.
Exactly. How does damage in my physical toe cause a pain in my phenomenal toe? What's the causal link?
Right. It feels like you're just pushing the problem back a step.
Yeah, and that's kind of the main criticism of sense datum theories, at least in terms of pain. Instead of explaining what pain is, it just sort of rephrases the problem in terms of these mysterious mental objects. And of course, for philosophers who are trying to fit the mind into a scientific worldview, introducing non-physical entities like sense data is a big no-no.
Okay, so if sense datum theories fell short, where did the philosophy of pain go next? The entry talks about perceptual theories as being kind of the next big thing.
Right.
So what's the central idea there?
Perceptual theories, they take a different tack. They say that feeling pain is actually a kind of perception, like seeing or hearing. The big difference is, instead of perceiving an object out in the world, you're perceiving something inside your own body.
So like you're perceiving tissue damage or some other bodily problem. But how does that square with all those features of pain we talked about? I mean, it's privacy, it's subjectivity, and that feeling of being absolutely certain about it.
Right, that's the big challenge for perceptual theories. You know, we can be wrong about what we see, we can misinterpret things, but with pain, it feels like our access is much more direct and certain.
So do they just deny those features, those common sense intuitions about pain?
Not quite. Most perceptual theorists, they actually make a subtle but important distinction. They don't identify pain with the tissue damage itself.
Okay.
What they say is, pain is the experience of perceiving tissue damage. So the focus shifts back to the subjective experience, which aligns nicely with the IASP definition we mentioned earlier.
So it's not the damage that is pain, but the experiencing of that damage. That seems like an important nuance.
It is. It gets at that feeling of immediacy, of having direct access to the experience itself. You might be mistaken about whether there is actual damage, but you can't be wrong about having the experience.
Right, so the pain is real, even if what you're perceiving as damage isn't actually there. The entry uses the example of seeing a red apple.
Right. That's a classic example for illustrating perception.
So what's the parallel with pain?
Well, when you see a red apple, there's a visual experience happening. Your eyes are taking in information, your brain is processing it, and you form the perception of a red apple. With pain, it's similar, but instead of visual information, you're getting somatosensory information.
Information from your body.
Exactly. And your brain processes that information, resulting in the experience of pain. But what's interesting is the difference in what grabs our attention, what becomes the focus. When we see an apple, we're primarily interested in the apple itself.
The object.
Right. But with pain, our attention is drawn to the experience itself, the feeling of hurt.
So it's like the experience itself becomes the object of our awareness, in a way. But then how do perceptual theorists explain that, we still talk about pain being in our body, in our hand or leg?
That's the location problem again, but perceptualists have a clever way of dealing with it. They say, When you say, I have a pain in my hand, what you're really doing is reporting on the content of your experience.
So it's not that the experience itself is located in your hand, but what it's about, what it's representing, is in your hand.
Exactly. It's like the experience is pointing to that location saying, hey, something's wrong here.
And this would explain why you can have phantom limb pain, right?
Exactly. Your experience is still representing damage in that location, even though the limb isn't there.
The content of the experience is wrong, but the experience itself is real.
Precisely. The experience itself is what constitutes the pain.
Okay, so that covers, like, the basic idea of perceptual theories.
Yeah.
But the entry then digs deeper, making a distinction between direct and indirect perceptual theories. We already talked about indirect realism with the sense data. How does that play into this?
Well, theoretically, you could be a perceptualist about pain and also believe in sense data. It would just mean that your perception of tissue damage is mediated by these sense data.
Like the pain sense datum is representing the tissue damage.
Right. But historically, not many philosophers have gone down that route, especially with pain. Maybe because if you're already committed to sense data, the traditional sense datum theory of pain kind of already covers that ground.
So the more interesting debate has been among those who lean towards direct realism,
Exactly.
those who think we perceive the world, including our own bodies, without these mental middlemen.
Right. So for them, the challenge is to explain how we directly perceive tissue damage and how that perception gives rise to the subjective feeling of pain.
And that's where we get to adverbialism,
Yeah,
right?
so-
The idea of perceiving redly rather than a red thing.
Yep, that's the core idea. So instead of saying you're perceiving a pain object, adverbialists say you're perceiving tissue damage, but you're perceiving it painfully.
Okay, so the painfulness is like a way of perceiving, not a thing being perceived.
Exactly. The painfulness modifies the verb perceiving rather than being a separate object.
So the feeling of throbbing, the sharpness, that's all captured by this adverb.
That's the idea. And this way, they can avoid introducing mental objects which aligns with their direct realist stance.
Okay, but the entry mentions that adverbialism has some problems. Like, how does it account for feeling multiple distinct pains at the same time?
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges. Like, how do you describe experiencing a sharp pain in your finger and a dull ache in your back at the same time using just adverbs? It gets pretty clunky.
And I guess even if you manage to do that, you're still left with the question of what these ways of perceiving really are. Are they just physical states of the brain?
Right. And if they're not, then you might be sneaking in some kind of dualism, like saying there are these non-physical properties of brain states.
And there's also the historical issue that adverbialism, at least in its early forms, didn't seem to capture the richness of our subjective experience.
Exactly. The feeling of pain is so vivid, so intense. It's hard to see how just saying, I perceive tissue damage painfully, really does it justice.
Okay, so we've got sense datum theories, perceptual theories, both direct and indirect. The entry then goes on to representationalist theories, which have become pretty influential.
Right.
What's the key insight that makes them so appealing?
Well, representationalists, they take a bold stance. They say that the entire feeling of pain, what it's like to have that pain, is identical to its representational content. So there's no mysterious feeling over and above what the pain is representing about your body.
Okay, so my headache feels the way it does because of what that feeling is representing about my brain.
Exactly. And this is different from indirect realism, where qualia or sense data are thought to represent things in the world. In representationalism, the phenomenal character, the way it feels, is literally the same thing as the representational content.
Okay, so how do they explain how these pain experiences come to have this representational content, this meaning?
Usually they appeal to naturalistic theories of content, so maybe it's causal covariation. Like pain states come to represent tissue damage because they're reliably caused by tissue damage.
Okay, so the connection is forged through repeated pairings.
Right, or it could be a teleological explanation, like pain evolved to signal damage because that's beneficial for survival.
So pain states have the function of representing damage, even
Okay.
if they're not always accurate.
Exactly.
Okay, so that explains how pain gets its meaning. But how does it explain the different qualities of pain? A sharp pain feels different from a dull ache.
Well, representationalists say that the different qualities correspond to different ways of representing the underlying damage. So maybe a sharp pain represents a very localized injury, while a dull ache represents more widespread inflammation.
So the feeling itself encodes information about the damage. And I guess the location problem is handled in the same way.
Right. The pain feels like it's in your foot because the experience is representing damage in your foot.
So it's not about where the experience is located in your brain, but but about what it's pointing to, what it's about.
Precisely. The content of the experience gives it its spatial character.
Okay, so that's a pretty neat solution. But the entry brings up a persistent problem, the problem of focus.
Right.
It's the observation that we tend to talk about the feeling of pain itself rather than the damage it's supposed to be representing. Like they say, I have a pain in my foot, not my body is signaling damage in my foot.
Yeah, it's a good point. With other kinds of perception, we focus on the object we're perceiving, not the act of perceiving itself.
Right? And I say, I see a tree, not I'm having the visual experience of a tree. So why is pain different? Why the focus on the feeling rather than the damage?
Well, one common response is to point to the unpleasantness of pain.
Makes sense. You're focused on making it stop.
Exactly. But the entry argues that this isn't the whole story. There are other bodily sensations that are unpleasant, like itches or tickles.
Right.
But we still talk about them as sensations, not as the things they're supposed to be representing.
When even with tastes and smells, which can be strongly pleasant or unpleasant, we still talk about the object. This coffee is bitter.
Right.
This cake is delicious.
Exactly. And there's also the evidence from pain asymbolia, where people report experiencing the sensory aspects of pain without the unpleasantness. So if it's not essential for pain to be unpleasant, why the focus on the feeling?
It does seem like there's something more going on there.
Yeah, it's a puzzle. And some philosophers have even suggested that this whole problem of focus might be a pseudo-problem. Like, maybe it's just an artifact of our language, of how we happen to talk about pain.
Okay, I can see that. Maybe if we had a different set of words, we wouldn't even see it as a problem.
Right. But the entry pushes back on that, saying that our language reflects deeper conceptual structures, and those structures are probably shaped by our needs and interests.
Right. Our concepts are tools that help us navigate the world.
Exactly. And for whatever reason, we've evolved to conceptualize pain differently from other perceptions.
Okay, so even if we can't fully explain why we focus on the feeling, it seems like there's a real difference there, a difference that's worth understanding.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another big challenge for representationalism, the problem of affective phenomenology.
Which is just a fancy way of saying pain hurts.
Exactly. It's not just information. It has this negative quality, this badness.
Right. And for representationalists who say that all feeling is representational content, that creates a problem.
Right. Because what is the badness representing? What's the content of that badness?
So how do they deal with that?
Some early perceptual theorists, they tried to explain it away by saying that painfulness is just the desire for the pain to stop.
Okay, but that seems backwards, right? I want the pain to stop because it's painful, not the other way around.
Exactly. It puts the cart before the horse. And it also doesn't really capture the feeling itself, the inherent badness of the experience.
So what do contemporary representationalists say?
Well, Ty and Bain, for example, they argue that the experience represents tissue damage as bad, as aversive.
Okay, but what does that even mean? How can an experience represent something as bad?
It's tricky. Some philosophers appeal to functional role semantics. They say that the badness comes from the role pain plays in our behavior and how it motivates us to avoid damage and seek help.
So it's bad because of what it makes us do.
Yeah, but if that's the case, then it's not clear why you need representationalism at all. Why not just say that the functional role is the badness?
Right, it seems like you're back to functionalism. So it seems like there's still work to be done there, figuring out how to fit the badness into a representationalist framework.
Absolutely. And that might be one of the reasons why some philosophers have moved away from purely perceptual or representational theories and towards what are called evaluative and motivational theories.
So these theories give more weight to the affective side of pain, to the fact that it makes us do things.
Exactly.
So what are some of the ideas there?
Well, Nelkin, he talks about an evaluative theory. He says that when you feel pain, you're not just passively receiving information about damage, you're also making an evaluation of that damage as harmful.
So it's like a judgment, this is bad.
Right. And he distinguishes that evaluation from the actual feeling of badness, which is interesting. And then Helm, he goes even further.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he says that pains and pleasures, they're literally felt evaluations of bodily states. So pain is just what it feels like to evaluate something as bad.
Interesting. So it's not just representing badness, it is badness.
Yeah, and it inherently motivates you to do something about it.
Okay, so that's a pretty radical view.
Yeah.
And I guess even within representationalism, There are attempts to incorporate this evaluative aspect.
Right. Ty and Bain, they both argue that pain represents damage as bad, although they disagree on what kind of badness it is.
So it's not just neutral information. It's got this added layer of evaluation.
Right.
And then there are the imperative or motivational theories. These really focus on the action-guiding aspect of pain.
Yeah, these are interesting. They see pain as a kind of command, a directive to stop doing something or to protect yourself.
Like, don't move that hand.
Exactly. And Klein, he's got this really radical view called imperativism.
I'm intrigued.
He says that the essence of pain is purely imperative content. Like, it's just a command, and that's it. Even the badness, the unpleasantness, is a second-order command. Like, it's a command to stop the original command. So you feel pain, which is the command to stop using your hand, and then the badness is like, hey, pay attention to that first command. Stop using your hand right now.
Okay, so it's like a meta command.
Exactly. And it seems like with these evaluative and motivational theories, functionalism becomes even more important.
Right. If pain is about making judgments or issuing commands, then understanding how it functions in our overall cognitive system, how it gets us to do things, is crucial.
Absolutely. And finally, we get to what might be the most radical idea of all, eliminativism about pain.
Which, for someone who feels pain on a regular basis, sounds pretty wild. I mean, are they saying pain doesn't exist?
Well, not exactly, but they are saying that our ordinary concept of pain is flawed, that it doesn't map onto anything real.
Okay, so what are the arguments for that?
Dennett, he's got this famous argument from reactive dissociation. He points to cases where people seem to experience the sensory aspects of pain without the unpleasantness, like after a lobotomy or when they're on morphine.
So they're registering the damage but not feeling it as bad.
Right. And he says, look, our concept of pain, it includes the idea that pain is essentially painful, that it's something we can't be wrong about. But these cases seem to contradict that.
Because they're experiencing pain without the painfulness, so to speak.
Exactly.
So Dennett says our concept of pain is incoherent. It doesn't make sense.
Right. He thinks we need to revise it, maybe even get rid of it altogether.
Wow, that's a pretty strong claim.
It is. But there are responses to Dennett. Some philosophers argue that maybe we were wrong to think that pain is always unpleasant. Maybe the badness is usually there, but it's not strictly necessary for something to be pain.
So our concept of pain is more flexible than Dennett gives it credit for.
Right. And then Hardcastle, she offers a different argument for eliminativism. She says our everyday understanding of pain as a simple sensation, it's just too simplistic.
Because science tells us it's a much more complex phenomenon.
Exactly. It involves sensory, affective, and cognitive components. She thinks we need to scrap the folk concept and go with a more scientifically informed view.
Okay, so different arguments for eliminativism, all challenging our basic assumptions about pain. And the entry wraps up with a really interesting observation. It points out this divergence between the way science is understanding pain and the way philosophers are thinking about it.
Right. Science seems to be moving towards a view of pain as more like an emotion, a flexible response to stimuli.
Whereas philosophers are still drawn to these perceptual and representational models.
Yeah, I think for a lot of philosophers, there's a real desire to ground pain in perception because we have a better understanding of how perception might be physically realized.
So it fits better with a naturalistic worldview. But even if pain isn't just perception, it seems like it must involve perception in some way.
Right. There are these specialized neural systems that are dedicated to processing noxious stimuli. So there's definitely a perceptual component. And the entry suggests a possible middle ground, a view where pain is weakly representational. It carries information about the body, but it also has this affective dimension that can't be reduced to representation.
So a kind of hybrid view.
Yeah, and maybe the affective part is best explained functionally, in terms of its role in motivating behavior.
But even with this hybrid view, the problem of focus still lingers. We still need to explain why we talk about pain in a different way than other perceptions.
Absolutely. That remains a challenge. And it seems like, despite all the progress that's been made, a truly satisfying account of pain is still a work in progress.
Indeed. So, listener, we've taken you on a pretty whirlwind tour of the philosophy of pain, from our everyday intuitions to some pretty mind-bending theories. And as a philosopher, you're probably thinking about all the connections to other areas of philosophy. Metaphysics, epistemology, the philosophy of mind. It all gets tied up in this one seemingly simple experience.
Yeah, and as we wrap up, we wanted to leave you with a question to ponder. Given all the complexities, all the different aspects of pain that we've talked about, does it even make sense to talk about pain as a single, unified thing?
Right. Maybe we need a more nuanced vocabulary, a way to talk about the different kinds of pain, the different ways it's experienced, the different ways it affects us.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's something for you to think about, to explore further. And if you're looking for more resources, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry has a great bibliography along with links to related entries. So there's plenty more to dive into if you're feeling, well, not in pain, but maybe intellectually stimulated.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.